I've always been fascinated with authors that want to break into the business of writing and publishing, going to the way of traditional publishing, especially considering how amazing self-publishing can be. At least, I'm kind of biased in that regards. But this was what leads me to today's conversation with our guest, Danica Favorite. Now, Danica and I actually got connected through an aggregate publishing platform called Publish Drive. And immediately I was like, okay, we got to sit down. We have to talk about the state of Publish Drive. And when I found out that she was a Harlequin romance writer, I thought, oh my gosh, this is really cool. And it come to find out, well, in this interview, it wasn't all roses. It wasn't an easy path for her. In fact, you actually find out there was a bit of struggle even getting an agent and then getting that agent to get her a deal. And then, of course, her segue from doing traditional publishing to self-publishing. Why did she do that? So we're going to find out all about that in today's episode with, it's part one of two episodes here with an interview with Danica Favorite from Publish Drive. And today we're going to be specifically speaking about Danica's career as an author. All right, Danica, it's official. We are getting to chat actually on the record this time, because last time we chatted was off the record about Publish Drive. But I don't want to talk about Publish Drive today. I want to talk about Danica Favorite and about your last name. We got to get it out the way. I've never met somebody with the last name of Favorite. Is that a pen name, or is that really like legitimately your last name?
It's really legitimately my last name. I just had a conversation with a guy about it the other day, and I pulled out my driver's license to prove it. So yeah, I am officially your favorite. So to everyone out there, I am legally entitled to be everyone's favorite.
Yeah, no arguments over here. So let's back it up just a little bit. Talk a little bit more about what got you into the business of writing, and when did you publish your first book?
It's an interesting question because I started writing. I've always been a writer. I was one of those kids who always had my little notebook and jotting down stories and things. But I always thought I would wait until I was older and retired to try to be an author. Because growing up, my best friend, her mom was an author, and they were dirt poor. Your stereotypical welfare family. I'd go dumpster diving with her, all that stuff. And I just thought, I never want that. Like, I don't want that for myself. And so I just kind of said someday, but that's not how I'm going to make my life. And then I had a baby, and I was a stay-at-home mom, living the dream, except that I was the only one in my peer group that was a stay-at-home mom with a baby. And I was bored and lonely because I love babies. Babies are fun. But there comes a point during the day where you're like, what the heck am I doing with myself? And so I thought, I'll just write a book. And 12 years later, I finally got published. So it was not the quick road to success. This was also pre-self-publishing. So I spent 12 years trying to publish with a traditional publisher, and here I am.
So what? Let's go to that traditionally published route here. When did you finish writing that book? Like the year itself, and then what was the process like for you trying to get a traditional publishing deal, and why you kind of veered away from that?
Okay, so this is also kind of a long story because 2005 is I had my youngest daughter was a year old. I met my now agent, Chip McGregor, and he and I just became friends. And at that point, I had decided I was frustrated with not selling. I was frustrated with all the rejection letters. And he and I just became friends. And I told him, I was straight up. I said, dude, I don't have anything for you. He's like, that's okay. Someday when you're ready, send me something. And so we were friends for a few years, actually. And at one point, he says to me, well, when are you going to send me one of your books? And I was like, we're friends. I wouldn't do that to a friend. I'm not going to take advantage of you. And he was like, that's the point. Take advantage of me. This is what I do. Yeah. And I only work with people I like. So send me your book. And so I did, and he rejected it. And he said, okay, here's what you need to work on. Send me something else. So I did. And once again, he says, it's not quite ready. Why don't you hire an editor to edit it and get it up to par, and we'll submit. I'm like, okay, great. I hired an editor. He loved it. He signed me, and he went ahead and started shopping it. That book never sold. And we did that process for probably 5 books. And I remember it was RWA, probably 2010, and we're in New York City. So someone can check my dates on this. I'm terrible at dates, so if I'm wrong on a date, forgive me. We're sitting at Sardi's, and famous restaurant bar in New York City in the theater district. And he says to me, looks me in the eye, he says, "You are not allowed to quit. You are not allowed to fire me until I get you a contract because you're a talented writer and I believe in you." And I was like, okay, like, what else are you going to say, right? And at this point, like, he at the time was one of the most sought after agents in the industry. Like, everyone wanted him.
Oh,
And so it was
cool.
hilarious that here I have one of the top agents in the industry and I can't sell my books. And he loved my writing. And so it wasn't that I was a bad writer. I just couldn't land my book in the right place.
Yeah.
And so fast forward to I'm getting frustrated, and he says, "Well, you love historicals. Why don't you write a historical?" And I said, like, that's my candy. That's what I do for fun. I'm not writing a historical. He's like, "I dare you." And I said, okay, fine. At the end of this dare, one of us is going to be right, and the other one who is wrong has to shut up about this forever. So I wrote this historical, literally thinking nothing is going to happen with it. Send it to him, and when that's what sold. Um, right?
It only took what, 5 publications to get to that?
Yeah, and that's what sold. Like that was really what did it, and that was 2011, I believe, and so that book came out in 2012. And yeah, and so that was how it all happened. Like, it really, honestly, I think it really was just I was trying so hard with those other books, and I think I was trying too hard. And then
Mm.
when I kind of did this book where I was just like, you know what, I'm doing this for fun and nothing is going to come of it and I don't care, and I had no attachment to it, boom, there it was. And I
Oh,
went on to do 8 historicals with them. They closed the historical line. And so then I moved into contemporaries. So now I have 19 books with Harlequin.
that is absolutely insane. Of course, we're going to have to come back to Harlequin at some point or another, because
Yes.
that's the part that you had told me. I was like, oh my gosh, I know what you're talking about. This is fantastic. So
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
love, I'd love to know those first 5 books. What was the niche, and why do you think it wasn't getting accepted? Was it a timing thing? Was it a demand, like lack of demand? What was that?
It's a couple things.
Okay.
Number one, so the niche, it was what I have always written, sweet romance. But I think number one, it was a timing issue because at the time, sweet romance was starting to not do as well in the market. So all of the
Okay.
publishers were no longer publishing sweet romance, and so I had to move it into Christian romance. It was the only option I had, so that's what I did. Um, but so I think that was part of it, is that I had a limited market for it. The other thing, because I went back to that one book, because what I'm actually doing right now is I am going through and revising some of these old books and putting them into a series, and then I'm going to self-publish them. And what I realized is it was a really good book. It really was. I think that was the comforting thing, was to read it and go, wow, I have always been a talented author. And that is amazing to me to be able to do that. But the problem, I mean, there were little problems. Like, I had a ton of head hopping. And I'm like, oh, well, now I know how to fix that. And so, like, I think it was little things like that. When you're trying to submit in a really tight market and you have just one little mistake like that, they're going to pass you over for somebody who doesn't make that mistake. And so I'm like, okay, you're lost because now I'm going to self publish it and I'm going to make more money. Ha ha ha. Or
Yeah.
at least that's the goal.
That's really cool. So what, in order to get this agent friend, he initially said, "No, not going to work with you, but if you fix these." What were the things that you had to specifically fix in order to get his attention?
So I think part of what I had to fix is that idea of, with my characterization, and really giving them that extra layer of depth. I have one of my biggest problems as a writer, it still is that it's all up here. And sometimes putting it on paper is like, oh, well, but that's what I meant. Well, it's not on the page, so the reader doesn't know that. Yeah, you're smiling
Yep.
because I bet you've encountered that just as well as I have.
Yep, I've lived that all
Yeah,
too
yeah, exactly.
well.
Exactly.
So this, as soon as you had that fixed, he brings you on. The five doesn't do really well. You get into the historical fiction avenue. Share with me, what was that shift for you? You said briefly, like, look, I just kind of gave everything up, but what did you actually, what was that aha moment? What was that light bulb moment that you went, this is what I'm going to do? And that's what ended up getting you the success.
Part of it was that non-attachment. I think that that's still something I'm learning. In fact, that's one of the things I'm working on now. Is I'm writing. Okay, it's going to be a couple of books, but I'm really working on writing some mindset for writers' books, because I think that is everything for writers. And for me, like, it's that non-attachment to a specific outcome. And I think it's non-attachment in general. I think that we get so laser focused on,
Yeah.
this is what I want, this is what I want, this is what I want, that we aren't open to other possibilities and other ideas. And we aren't listening to the messages around us. And so, like, for me to be able to just let go of that really strong drive in one direction that wasn't happening, I wasn't open to anything else. And I think that that's what hurt me for a really long time. Once I started opening up myself to different possibilities and different ideas, it was like, whoa. And, even now I'm struggling with that. I started in the fall. I have some really specific goals I'm trying to meet. And I sat down, I did this intention setting thing in this group that I was in. I set this intention, I think this was back in August. And I was really mad because I came back in September and I'm like, not only am I not there, I'm further than I was. And I'm really mad about it. And so I set a new intention and I made it a little less tight. And I still didn't get there. And so here I am, we're at the end of November. When I set my November intention, I did it. It's so much looser than it's ever been. And it really was about this idea of what does need to happen. Like, I've been so focused on what I think I want to happen. Let
Mhm.
me loosen that up and just say, I'm going to be open to what happens and what needs to happen. And funny enough, last night, 3 a.m., wide awake, and the breakthrough I needed for the story I've been struggling with came. And so, of course, at 3 a.m., I was up writing because it was, but it was like, that's the life of the writer, right? You go when
Yep.
you're inspired. And
Mhm.
so it was really just letting go of just, you're gripping so tight sometimes. And when you just
Mhm.
kind of let go, it's like, oh, wait a second. And um, and here's the thing, all of the work I've been doing on myself, on my writing, on my mindset, on all of that, everything I started in August, that all had to happen and come out so that the idea and the aha that I had today in November, that all had to happen first. And now that it's
Mhm.
happened, I messaged a friend about the book today, and my friend was like, "Oh wow!" I'm like, "Right." And so it's really about trusting that process and not holding on tightly. And that's where I started to get my success. And every time I start to struggle, it's because I forget that and I hold on too tightly and I don't see all the other stuff.
Hmm. What would be a great way to self audit? If somebody's listening to this podcast, what would you recommend to them if they are getting gridlock, kind of like as what you were saying?
The first thing is to ask yourself, okay, so what happens if this thing doesn't come to fruition? What's going to be the result? Like, what's the so what of this? Like, really, what's the dire consequence? Are you going to die? No, no, you're not. Just to let you know, you're not going to die. It's not going to kill you. You
Yeah.
might think in the throes of that depression that it's there, but like ultimately, like what's the worst that can happen if this thing doesn't happen? And where can you find the joy in it not happening? And are there lessons you can learn through the process, whether it happens or not? And that, going back to that first book, actually, the first book I talked to my agent about, and by the way, he is still my agent. He is one of my best friends. Like we now have this lifelong friendship because we
Nice.
worked through that process together. And one of the things he said to me about this one book that I had talked to him about, it was a nonfiction book. And he says, sometimes I feel like the books we write are not for the public, they're for ourselves. And sometimes you need to write the book to get it out so that there is room for the other stuff inside you to come in. And so I really took that to heart, that sometimes when I'm really stuck and the book isn't happening the way I want it to happen, I can say, okay, hold on. Is this book for me or is it for the world? And the truth is that even the books that are for the world are still for me. Like there's always, I know as authors, we get that question of, well, is this book about you? How much of this book is about you and people you know? Well, the answer is, of course, none of it. And yet
Yeah.
there are pieces of ourselves in that. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I have learned, and this is why this book has been so hard to come out, is that I have learned that the lessons that my characters learn are often a lesson I need to learn either to begin with or on a much deeper level. Like I think, oh yeah, I've got forgiveness down. And always when I'm writing the book about forgiveness, somebody pops into my life that I need to forgive and haven't. Every single time. I'm like, okay, fine. And so really, going back to that question of when it's not happening, to say, okay, let me set this aside for a minute. And let me just focus on my own personal journey and what's happening in my life and what's happening in my journey and what needs to happen. Because I think that we forget how deeply entwined we are in our work. And if we aren't tending to our writer self, if we aren't tending to that inner world, what's happening in our books isn't going to be good and it's not going to work.
I'm having so much fun chatting with you. The time's going so fast, and I'm watching as it ticks down. So if we happen to go a little bit over, I don't think it's going to be a big issue. I'm curious, are you a discovery writer or are you a plotter? Or you a pantser or plotter? I try to use the politically correct term of discovery writer.
Yeah. So I'm both.
Okay.
It's really weird. I have a very hybrid process, and so
Okay.
what ends up happening is I come up with the concept of the story,
Okay.
and then what I need to do. I am so old school, but I really believe in brain science, and the brain science works for me. I end up taking out a notebook and I handwrite as much as I need to of the story to understand the story, because there is something with brain chemistry and brain science, and I've read a lot of articles about it, that act of this actually connects different synapses and pathways in your brain to make your brain work better.
Hmm.
And what I have learned is if I don't do that piece of the process, my story isn't going to ever work. And so I do that piece. And then I'm like, okay, I've got a handle. I start writing the book. I usually get a chapter or two into writing the actual book. And then the story clicks. And then I plot the book. I also dictate. And so for me, dictating my book is really just about telling myself the story. And so my handy dandy little recorder, that's my friend that I tell my book to. And so I tell the story of my book. And like I said, by the time I get to chapter 1 or 2, the end of chapter 2, sometimes chapter 3, then I sit down and I plot the book, because when you're recording, I really do need that guideline and that map to say, okay, this is where I'm going. Otherwise, I go off on really weird tangents because that's how I am in conversation anyway. So the outline really helps me stay on track.
No wonder you and I get along so well. We're all over the place. I tell you, we're getting towards the end of the interview. I definitely want to put a pin in talking about Harlequin and your experience with them. So let's come back to that on another day for another interview.
Okay.
So I want to wrap up today's interview with a question I ask everybody else. What advice do you have for aspiring authors and self-publishers out there?
My advice for aspiring authors and self publishers is you really have to trust the process. Your process, your path is going to be different from everyone else's. And you have to honor that. You have to figure out what your process is, what your path is, and honor it. Because the thing that I've noticed is that, especially new authors, they are taking all of the advice from every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there, and it's not the right advice from them. It just isn't. And I love you, Dale, but sometimes your advice isn't right for me. And that's
It's
okay.
true.
And it's not right for every author, and that's okay. And I think we have to get to that place of accepting our process and saying, okay, here's this information. It's good information. Is it right for me? Okay. If it's right for me, I'll follow it. If it's not right for me, I won't follow it. Now, I'm going to give a caveat to that because I do think that sometimes our egos get in the way and we think, oh, yeah, that advice isn't for me. I'm not going to do that. And the truth is, that's exactly the advice you need. I have this friend. She wrote one book. It was the book of her heart. And she had a best-selling author who was willing to read it and critique it and do all of this stuff and came back with the edits, and she didn't like them. And so she rejected all of them and she published the book. And so she had her big thing, and I read the book, and I'm like, I know exactly, because she was telling me and complaining about all of the edits this author had told her to make. And I was reading the book and I was like, yeah, you should have done that. and so her book only sold 100 copies. And she was like, see, the publishing thing never works. Because of course, 100 copies were her friends and family. And she's like, publishing doesn't work. And I was like, no, publishing does work. It just didn't work for you because you weren't willing to listen. And so it's really this fine edged sword of really like not only saying, is this right for me? But then also saying, is my rejection of this advice my ego or really something in me that says this isn't right for me? And so it really is about knowing yourself and accepting your process and being willing to allow that to change and to shape you. So it's like I said, it's kind of a double-edged sword, but I think you have to have that both because um, a reality of the publishing world. And I think that if you've got a book and it didn't work, maybe you do need to look at the advice that you didn't take and say, okay, maybe I shouldn't take in that advice. Like maybe I thought it wasn't for me, but maybe it is.